Still tuneless. Charlie's been threatening to sing a jingle with my name in it here, but I've put him off. So it's edition 1885 of your newspaper for the 11th of May. Now, as I've just said, we haven't got any tunes. No. Charlie was tempted to invent a jingle with my name in, but I detest people on the radio who have their name in their show 26 times in 1 hour.
The Steve Binns Show.
Well, Charlie, we've just survived another Liverpool comeback.
We have.
And on the way down, we
tried
Radio Merseyside. That was all they had on. Charlie said, we'll try Radio 2.
And went to Radio 2, and that was on the blooming talking
Jeremy Vine with You'll Never Walk Alone.
Yeah.
God dear me. So there's no escape. There's no escape, yeah? Anyway, never mind. I've got to admit it was a remarkable match.
It was.
While we're on sport, Kentucky Derby.
Oh, yeah.
Last Saturday night.
I saw it.
Yeah, last Saturday night, 11 o'clock. On my betting account, listeners, you've got to have a minimum bet of a tenner, which I do not like putting on one horse.
Yeah.
So 11 o'clock, Saturday night, I thought, right, here we go. £5 each way on maximum security. Flew in,
God.
7-1, switched off the radio, went to bed. Rang up on Monday. I found out there was no money in my account, so I rang up not to complain but to ask. And it turned out that for the first time since 1865 or whatever it was, they disqualified my winner.
Yeah.
For impeding the other horses.
But the thing was, it was obvious he did impede it.
Well, Donald Trump's involved this morning.
Is he? What's he doing?
He says it didn't impede it, but there's going to be another appeal tomorrow. Now, here's a question. My bet was declared void, so I lost my £55. If they alter the result again tomorrow, back in favour of maximum security, who thinks I will get my money back? No.
Don't you?
No chance. Absolutely. The bet no longer exists. 'Tis void. 'Tis enough. 'Tis gone. Anyway, there's my tale of woe. And with that in Liverpool, it's been a funny week.
Well, a friend was telling me the other day, not the other day, that last night, that one of his mates had put £50 on Liverpool winning last night, and it come in at 18-1.
Wow. I wonder what you'd have got for 4-0. God dear.
Yeah.
Me. Anyway, I wasn't on. Right. So today, well, I've always been fascinated by what people said about us. Historically, I mean. So today, that's what I'll be dealing with. A few visitors. Most of them are Americans, I'm afraid, but
you can't be
blamed for everything.
You can't choose your visitors.
I've always liked trivial things as well, like bizarre bits of trivia, I've got to say, much to the annoyance of some academics. But I've always liked it. For instance, here's one for you. In 1858, Duke Lionel, who was the fourth son of Edward III, launched an expedition from here to the southeast Irish coast. And there's a document with a list of all the people who sailed with the royal party and what their names were and what their jobs were. Well, at the bottom of this list, aged 18, in charge of the meat supply, storage, whatever, is a young man called Geoffrey Chaucer, who becomes, later, one of England's most famous poets, Canterbury Tales, etc.
Yeah.
So I've always been fascinated by kind of weird visitors. Now, what about Daniel Defoe? Here's a man, Robinson Crusoe and all that. Now, Defoe was a spy, basically, and one of the jobs that Queen Anne gave him was to go around the country, sit in bars, and listen to what people were saying. Sounds like a good job to me. Just to see if there was any anti-government discussion. Well, I mean, you go into any pub anywhere and there's anti-government discussion.
Of course there is. There is at the moment, anyway.
Yeah. Now, when he came to Liverpool, he describes it, he says, although small at the moment and underdeveloped, this town will become soon one of the wonders of Britain. Now this is 1700, so there's no dock yet.
No, there isn't. No.
There's no St Peter's Church yet.
There's no Liverpool football team.
No, thank God. There's no town hall.
No,
Everton. No, that might be a blessing. No town hall. So he did well to spot it, except that a later writer has suggested, who didn't like Defoe much, that he got as far as Chester, got drunk, and paid someone in a Chester pub to tell him what it was like in a Liverpool one. A man called Thomas Johnson said this later on to try and prove that Defoe had never been in the town and was a fraudster and was receiving his money for nothing. Oh, he also wrote Moll Flanders, by the way, one of the naughtiest novels that was ever written. Definitely an after the water sheddings job. Yeah. And then there was another traveller called Celia Fiennes. Now, Celia was very unusual. A woman traveller on her own, with a horse, going all around the country, everywhere, and just commenting on what she saw. So she comes to Liverpool and she comments on the second town hall, not the one now, the one before that. She also comments about the men being well dressed but rather spindly in the leg, whatever that means. Anyway, she was very good about us in a funny sort of a way, but then she escaped to Chester. Now, one of the other comments, and a lot of these comments are not very good. I mean, obviously, sometimes they just weren't good about anywhere, but sometimes it was just us. So Mrs. Felicia Hemans, who wrote a poem called, which starts off with, "The boy stood on the burning deck when all but he had fled," about the Battle of the Nile, which became more famous than anything else she ever wrote. And another of her poems, which the Americans always quote on, was her. But she stayed in Wavertree for a while, what is now Wavertree for a while, and described it as the last place God made and the first place that God deserted. She disliked the town and its people. Oh dear, can't win them all, can you?
No.
Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an Opium Eater, a book about his life as a drug addict in the 1720s when he lived in Everton, the village of Everton, then way beyond the town boundary.
They had a good team, you know.
Very much sought after, I doubt it. Very much sought after. And he said, Everton would be all right, but everybody seems to be Welsh. he didn't.
I wonder why they said that.
He didn't like it. He didn't like the Welsh anyway. So he lived in this cottage in Everton, and he taught at a little school there for a while. But he wasn't very complimentary about us. And there was a minister at the chapel in Gattaca who was asked about Mr. De Quincey, and he said, well, he has now left the town, much to his disadvantage and much to the town's advantage. So he was glad that they got rid of him. Now, another thing I wanted to mention was, I've always been a fan of the Bronte sisters. Now,
haven't we all?
What a sad life. I mean, so many of them, and they all died so young, and they're blaming the drainage in Haworth now, by the way, I think. But two of the sisters, of course, in all families, there's always a brother who's trouble. In ours, it's Arthur. But Bramwell was always on the juice. He was always on the ale. And in one of Charlotte's letters, there's her and Emily, and they come to Liverpool, which is quite a journey in those days. And, oh yeah, Charlie's going to stop me now. Go on, Charlie.
Go on.
No. Anyway, they come to Liverpool, and they're in search of Bramwell, and he's been on the ale for 24 hours, apparently. And there's in this letter, it says, we entered every pub along the whole of the Dock Road, and were received with much surprising politeness. But we were unable to locate Bramwell. I'd like to mention some of the things that Charles Dickens said about us. Now, Dickens made 17 visits to Liverpool.
He liked Liverpool, apparently.
He did. And there's a book which claims that he made 8 visits. But when I finished my research, and it wasn't complete, I'd counted 17 visits. Dickens and Liverpool is quite interesting because by nature, Dickens was liberal in his politics. And Liverpool was, at that time, a very conservative town. So, when he was complimentary about us, it meant something. His first visit was 1842, and it was just when he was en route to America, which he wasn't massively complimentary about, by the way.
Yeah.
His last visit was 1869, only 1 year before he died. And they gave him a banquet at St George's Hall.
Mm.
And there were 600 guests. I've got a copy of the menu. Quails. You need quite a few quails to make a sandwich.
Yeah.
And Dickens, according to one report, comes into the hall and they tell him that he's got to speak in the main hall. And of course, remember, there's no microphones or anything then.
No.
So he says, I'm not speaking in here, no one will hear me. So he apparently he sent some of the volunteer cadets down to the pier head to collect flags of all the available ships to hang off the chandeliers to deaden the sound. That night there were 16 speakers. Imagine that.
Yeah. 16
speakers. And Dickens made 3 speeches. One, his main one, and 2 others in reply to the toasts. These things went on for hours. Anyway, at the end of in the 3rd speech, he comments on the changes that he's seen in Liverpool over these 27 years. And he admits to the difficulties that the town had. And he congratulates the city fathers on their improvement. He mentions libraries, parks, improvement in school services, although that was more the government's doing, I suppose. But he comments on the idea of a town council which he hopes will be elected by more people as time goes on. Didn't say women, but more people. Slowly but surely taking an interest in the day-to-day lives of the citizens. That is, becoming more and more involved in the day-to-day lives of the people and attempting to improve the facilities of the town and attempting to create a community. Well, he died a year after that, but it is interesting that although he might not have agreed with them politically, he was prepared to make that statement at the end of his life with 27 years of experience here in a city that he was fascinated by. Fascinated by the diversity, the difference between people, the different types of people, the idea of rich and poor, which has always been good for fiction writers, I suppose. Now let's try a few more. What about the American merchant Samuel Kirkwood, tea seller? Now,
he didn't have a place in Boston.
Well, I wonder about this because he's in an awfully bad temper. When he came to Liverpool in 1780, which is only 7 years after the famous Boston Tea Party, and he came to Liverpool and he stayed here, and he said, this is what he said in a letter to his cousin, Liverpool is dirty in an eminent degree. whatever that means.
It means the girls are quite accommodating.
I scarce saw a well-dressed person while I was there. It was only tolerable because we knew that we were leaving. Then he said, the docks are stupendous. Well, by 1780 there was about 4 of them, I think. So there you are. So he had a go at us, but he did have to admit at the end that the docks were stupendous. Another American merchant, Benjamin Silkman, came here and stayed at the Liverpool Arms in Castle Street.
Yeah.
He was on his way to study medicine in Edinburgh. And he tells a fascinating story about how you have to buy your luggage from the warehouse. So, what happened was, it's a bit of a scam really. When the ships arrived, the luggage was taken off the ships and then put in these dock warehouses, and then you had to go and buy your bags, your luggage, from the dock warehouses. Sounds like a bit of a scam to me. What do you think? If you carried your own bags, you think that might have been fair enough, but hardly any of them did. He said, for breakfast, it was always boiled egg. Oh, there was occasional ham, but it was very occasional, and I wasn't certain from which animal it had come. Anyway, he talks about visiting Bullock's Museum, which is one of the first museums in the country, and he goes on about suits of armour that he's seen there. On leaving Liverpool, he described it as an asylum of perpetual darkness. Well, there you go. Another happy merchant set on his way. Mr. Silkman also describes a visit to the blind asylum. Now, this is what later became my school at Wavertree, but then was in Commutation Row. And he gets taken on a visit to this, and he says, those men live in perpetual darkness, and he said their life is only to be compared with the incurables. And then finally another cheerful saying, remember, for the blind the sun never rises, and when it does, it rises in vain. Oh, I don't know, Charlie, I quite like a bit of sun on my back, really.
So do I, yeah.
He said, there were more women than men in the asylum, but the men were in no position to make any use of them.
That's a bit sad, isn't it?
Not in this. That wasn't the one I went to. Anyway, he does say what an important port it will become, but he comments on the slow turnaround of the ships. But I mean, there might have been 100 in the port on any given day at that time, and he comments on a 10-day wait for the turnaround of a ship. But that was his only comment on departing. A final salvo from Mr. Silkman was only received 5 days later, when he wrote from Edinburgh to yet another cousin in Boston, by the way. Liverpool, the dock workers work hard when they work. They work between ale. There you go. Now, another Boston merchant, Joseph Ballard. Now, they took Ballard to the blind school. Again, it must have been on the Grand Tour, this. It's a remarkable place, he said, only to be commended by the fact there was a money box in every room. Presumably, they were trying to an appeal. A very solemn choir, but they sang well. He also gives the first description of a Braille book that I've ever seen. This is written in around 1820, and he describes a book. It's part of the Acts of the Apostles, by the way. Yeah. And it is, I think, the first description of a Braille book that we have in our literature. The Liverpool Library was one of the first to receive Braille books and to have them on the shelves. But the decision was taken in the 1860s that all Braille books would be put in one central library and would be borrowed from that one central point. So all the libraries then gave up their books to this one established library, which of course only could really be used by people in the town where it was, until the postal system came about in the 1870s, when for the first time they were able to send and receive books. But they were so precious that they were all handmade, that I doubt whether these books were ever allowed into what we would call general circulation. William Brown, who William Brown Street is named after, merchant banker, Ulsterman, but spent most of his time in America, came back to us. In the end, he came back to us and donated vast amounts of money for the William Brown Street Library and the museum. Opened around 1860, just before he died. On his first visit in 1832, his description of Liverpool is very interesting. This town is full of busy people, full of endeavour, but also full of gloom. A day-to-day struggle for survival, where every breath is precious and fought for by every citizen. It's a very interesting article that Brown writes. It gives an impression of harshness, really, and a day-to-day struggle, yes, I think certainly for a large majority of the population, and is a mixture of describing what appears to be success in a trading sense, in a wealth sense, but also a sense where the majority of people are being left behind. This is the matter that Dickens addresses earlier on, when he finally suggests that the town leadership, the people who run the town, are, for whatever reason, making an effort to improve the lives of the people. Now, when Brown donated his money, and when he spoke at the banquet in his honour, he was concerned that the working men, he only mentions men, by the way, that working men should learn to read. And he wants books to be made available to them. But he is very concerned about the subjects: geography, travel, light romance, but let them avoid history and politics. He felt it was quite dangerous if people began to do that. And although he might value education, in a wider sense, he has these concerns of the Victorian upper class, that to some extent too much education might be dangerous. He shouldn't have worried, because in 1816 there was a Bible competition here in one of the very early newspapers, the Liverpool Mercury. It had only been open 3 years, and the winner was a man in Circe Street, C-I-R-C-E Street, who had remembered 1,836 verses of the Bible. Well, that sounds to me like a very long Saturday afternoon. He wins the competition. Doesn't say what the prize is, by the way. Another merchant, Zachariah Allen, makes the comment that what Liverpool needs is manufactories, because they don't make anything, he said. They buy and they sell, and they import and they export, but they don't make anything. So a lot of the work is seasonal, and casual, which it certainly was, and it leads to much idleness upon the streets. He also mentions this same incident again that we had before, although this is a few years later, of having to buy your luggage from the dock warehouses, which appears to be mentioned by many visitors, and not very happy about it either. It is interesting that this merchant, Allen, comments on manufacturers, because obviously Liverpool was so busy transporting goods that it never really considered manufacturing. I mean, there were obvious exceptions, the pottery industry, for instance, and others. It was only, I suppose, in more modern times, when the port began to reduce as a port, that they started to deliberately bring in what today we would call large-scale manufacturers. Another Albemarle Barton, another visitor, this time a merchant who'd worked mostly in Mexico and South America, describes the town as being very successful and interesting. But every building is coated black. Well, of course, this is the smoke and the soot, and obviously the buildings were all pretty much like that, certainly in the middle of the 19th century when this chap was here. The amount of visitors we get who are prepared to write and comment is fascinating. Whatever anybody thinks about Liverpool, they were on the grand tour. It was somewhere where you had to go. Important visitors expected to come here, and when they came here, they expected to be shown around and to be shown what an important town they had visited.
If I might just butt in and make a... I do apologise to the listeners for the racket that's going on. We're right next to a building site that's building the new home bargains facility at Speak. So that's what all the racket is, and I do apologise for it. Not that we can do anything about it.
Irving, another American writer who wrote the famous short story Rip Van Winkle. Remember, he goes to sleep and then wakes up.
Yeah, sounds like me.
He stayed here and worked in a cotton warehouse on Water Street. And he makes a very interesting comment when he says that despite the lives that many people are forced to lead by the system in which they live, they are surprisingly friendly and in the main decent, honest and hard-working people. But many of them are on what might be described, I suppose, as being upon a short fuse. Oh, well done, Washington. I think he might be in there. Now, William Roscoe, who was described as the most literary man in Liverpool, who opposed the slave trade, vaguely, wrote some very interesting biographies which are factually completely incorrect. I've read them. Described the town near the end of his life as a bastion of ill-favoured beings. But by then, things had turned against him. He'd gone bankrupt, he'd had to sell all of his stuff, and by the end of his life, things had, shall we say, turned against him. He died in Lodge Lane in 1831. Now, by then things had weighed him down, I suppose, and his comments become more arid as his life ends. Now, a Scottish visitor. Now, I like this one. This chap comes to us from Dunfermline, a Scottish minister, a Scottish merchant and a part-time Methodist minister, a man called Worthington, and he describes the inns in the town, pubs, how welcoming they are and how friendly they are, and there is always somebody to stand you a pint. Well, that sounds all right to Mr. Worthington, seeing his name. And he also comments that in Liverpool the public houses are very but he does end it on a bad note, because he stays in a hotel on Dale Street. He doesn't name it. He stays in a hotel on Dale Street, and he says, "The room I stayed in was the dirtiest that I have ever seen, nearly as bad as the one in Dunfermline I stayed in last year." Poor old Dunfermline. Everybody expects tips down here for whatever you do for them and whatever they do or don't do for you. So there you go. I've just found another nugget from our Scottish merchant friend. He says he was woken during the night by profane language under my window. Words that I have never heard before or since. It was miraculous how they were able to fit swear words into their sentence, which made the sentences, such as they were or were not, grammatically incorrect. They were also able, I've heard this by the way now, they were also able to get swear words within ordinary words. Then he says, why is it on a Sunday morning every bell in the town rings? Yeah. Now, well, it's Sunday, it's churches. In Scotland, we are more careful about these matters, he says. And then he departs. Now, Bayard Taylor, travel writer. Now, Taylor went round the whole of Europe writing a book about nearly everywhere he went. And when he comes to Liverpool, he makes a very interesting comment about considering the coldness of the climate and the inclemency of the weather. There are a great many people sleeping in the streets. Everything can be bought or sold in the streets here, from gingerbread to shoelaces. But the best sellers and the best traders are those who are able to sell oranges at twopence and threepence per time. Going back to one of Dickens's visits, he wanted to write a piece for his magazine, Household Words, about the Liverpool police and how they worked and what they did. And a superintendent who knew him, well, he'd known him as an inspector, but he was now superintendent, let him go on patrol. It all went very well until Dickens ruined it. Because at one point, and it was the oranges that reminded me of this, at one point, the police, it's nearly midnight, and a lot of these children are under, 8, 9 and 10. And the police, they're selling oranges outside the theatre, the Theatre Royal. And the police move them on. And Dickens says to this now superintendent, this money that they're making by selling these oranges, no matter how you might deplore them being out so late, may be the difference between survival and starvation for their families. Why don't you leave those children where they are? At least they are under lights. Street lights, he means. At least they are under lights. And why don't you leave them alone and try and catch some real criminals? He wasn't allowed to go on patrol with them the next night. That was the end of his. The end of his time with the Liverpool police. He wrote a very interesting article, and he does actually say that the police were disappointed by his comments. Another writer, there aren't many women writers at this time, which is a shame. But one, a lady called Lucy Thornton, who was primarily a naturalist and a bird watcher, comments on the sombre appearance of the town. You can see why that was, I suppose. And she walks through the town, and people tell her it's dangerous, but I cannot say that at any point I felt threatened. And every time people spoke to me, it seemed to be polite, although many of them I could not understand. I heard more languages walking down one of Liverpool's main thoroughfares than I have in London in 5 minutes. Now that is fascinating. We all think now when we're in town and we hear so many different languages that way back in the 19th century there were just as many. At that time there were newspapers in 20 different languages, many of them for seafarers and lists of available ships. But there were still newspapers in 20 languages published here in 1896.
It's funny, you know, isn't it, that when I was a kid, they still had the Echo and fleets of ships coming in and out of Liverpool, and it all sort of came to an end with the containers. I just think it's fantastic. They ship more stuff through Liverpool now than they ever did. Before the containers came along.
Because you can get as much in one container as 35 ships.
Yeah.
And the average crew would be, 8 to 10 people now, apparently.
Yeah, and hardly there's hardly anybody working.
William Cullen Bryant, who later became American Secretary of State, he came here. And he makes a comment about the fog and the rain delays the customs. But even as late as the 1880s, he comments about how many packages of his were broken en route from the ship to the warehouse. And again, he goes back to this idea of then having to pay to buy your own stuff back. He comments upon the solid construction of the town and its warehouses. That's all down to Mr. Hartley, the dock superintendent, who was responsible for most of the dock warehouse building. He comments on the town spreading into the interior and how he can imagine how in the next generation it will spread far beyond its now limits. The dialect they speak cannot be related to any language, never mind English, and is more like the language of the native Indians of the Appalachians.
What are you talking about, Mike?
You're talking about our lads, you know, I can't understand it, but they great, are they? Anyway, so he couldn't understand us either. So I like that one. About to go back to Harvard to study law, comments on the fact that everybody smokes in Liverpool, even the women. Also, he makes an interesting comment about how there's a scam on the docks to avoid cigarette duty payments. Doesn't explain what the scam is, by the way. He talks about a romantic cemetery walk that he does with a temporary girlfriend and how clean the shops are. One of the best buildings, he said, is the Sailor's Home. But he does comment on the number of suicides that have taken place there in recent months because of the doom-laden lives that many of the older seafarers live, with no chance to settle or no family or no local or obvious connection. The docks are a remarkable embellishment of the town and have created an extraordinary length and size with their opportunity for the import and export of goods. Now, the town, how can I put this, has to some extent made and broken people, so that many people have been utterly impressed by it, especially as you move into more modern times, especially when the waterfront takes on the aspect that it, say, would have in our lifetime. But the opposite of that, for instance, is the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. Now, I'm not very good at poetry, and I could not read his poem to you, even if I was able. I'm not a good enough reader to read them. They are unlike any other poems I've ever read in the English language. Most famous is one called The Wreck of the Deutschland, which we all learnt at school. It's about a ship going down where 5 nuns were lost, amongst other people, but the poem particularly mentions these nuns. Hopkins's poetry, as I say, is unlike anything you've ever read or would read. He didn't live very long. He was a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, who had been a convert from the Church of England. He worked in 8 different cities in 4 years. They never left him alone. They were always moving him. It all went very badly wrong, and he died at a very young age in Ireland. His time in Liverpool was so depressing. And when he writes about it, which he does, it's this mixture of a savage feeling about how much poverty there was, but almost this kind of vague idea without actually stating it, that to some extent some of the people have brought it upon themselves and have contributed to their own situation. Then he regrets thinking in those terms. So it's a real mixture. It's a mess, really. When he writes letters, what you actually see is how mixed up and messed up his mind is, and how depressed he probably is about his inability to do anything about, well, anything really. But he's remarkable. But he says that Liverpool has taught me everything I know and many things that I don't know, and has partly ruined my life. It's a sad indictment. Now, here's the thing, just to end on a more cheerful note. Dr. Raffles. Now, this isn't your Raffles of Singapore fame or the burger, the gentleman burger. This is a preacher. Now, Stamford Raffles was a very fine speaker. He was an eccentric Anglican minister. But, like, if you wanted to hear him, you had to queue up. And he said, in Liverpool, everybody will listen to you, at least for the first 2 minutes. But if they then don't like you, they will intervene, and they will shout, and they will argue with you, and they will not accept that you are the speaker and they are not. However, I must also say that if I spoke in London and got 30 people, I would be absolutely delighted. In Liverpool, if I got less than 300, I would be disappointed. They are a town that will listen to everything you say and will then ignore 95% of it. So he's another of my favourites.
Sounds like an accurate description of modern day Liverpool.
Yeah, and he was a great character. Another comment, another American visitor, a preacher, a New York preacher, Severus Hastings. Hastings says, there are people here poorer than anything that I have seen in New York. However, they are kind people, except when it comes to the matter of slavery. Now, he is talking about from an abolitionist point of view, and he finds it quite astonishing how many ordinary people in Liverpool are prepared to defend and admire slavery, especially from the American South's point of view. But that's, I suppose, another story. A man called Samuel Cox was one of the first people to write about population. And he is very good on the short and the pithy sentence, for instance. Now, what about Liverpool? What do we say then? Well, let's just cut to the chase, Samuel. A very large and transient population. That means we move about, by the way. Not favourable. The fag end of humanity, but yet funny with it. He also comments on how he couldn't get a room in the hotel because everywhere was so busy, and he also comments on the pretty maid who served him his morning fried eggs in the hotel parlour. So there you are, everyone. How long have I got on my?
2 seconds.
2 seconds. Well,
time's up.
Time is nearly up. I'm going to have to come back to you a few more of these because I got a bit sidetracked because I haven't mentioned most of my favourites yet. So,
Well, you can go on for a bit
so
if you want.
I just want to end with Samuel Adams. Now, Adams was the son of the American ambassador. And he says, Chester, affluent but miserable. Liverpool, poor but happy. So that was one of his final comments. And here's one just to end with. This is written in the 1890s by a man called Samuel Sheldon, who had lived in Australia for most of his life and came back to Liverpool. And I've just come back to this town, which I have not seen for some 30 years. It is an extraordinary place. Everybody rushes out about everywhere. And since I have departed, and since I have returned, they have become obsessed with three things: drink, each other, and this extraordinary new passion of theirs, football. Oh well, I don't know what we can say about that, Charlie.
Neither do I.
So there you are, everyone.
But the first team, the first professional football team in Liverpool was Everton.
Yes, at least in the 1890s they didn't have to put up with the Reds. Anyway, I shall return to these pastures because I'm very interested in these, and I've realised I brought 9 pages of these with me and I'm only on page 3. So I shall return in 2 weeks and... I didn't mention Buddy was here before, did I?
No, you didn't know he was
Goodness
here.
me, Buddy's
He's been very
here.
quiet, hasn't he?
Buddy's been here and he's been very quiet. Well, as Charlie said, we're sorry about home and bargain, but we've not been for a while and it rises up out of the mist.
It's like the phoenix rising
It's like
from
the
the
phoenix rising. So anyway, right everyone, so we'll be back in 2 weeks.
As we've got no signature tune to work with today, I'll end with Steve Bear. I just realised while you were all while we were switching everything down that I hadn't actually mentioned our upcoming show from the Bentley Operatic Society, which is Fiddler on the Roof, and it's on the Stanley Theatre in the Liverpool University building by Mountford Hall, and that's all next week from Wednesday to Saturday. So if you're passing, give us a knock and come and have a look.
What's your pièce de résistance? What's your
I'm playing Laser Wolf, the an old gentleman who wants the hero Tevye's eldest daughter.
Oh, and you got the beard to prove it, haven't you?
I have got a beard. Yeah, I've grown a beard and I've grown my hair long to look like a Russian Jewish peasant,
which you're not. You're neither of those three,
no,
are you?
No.
Well, anyway, so he has grown his beard and his hair for his art, listeners.
I have. Yeah.
And he would give you a line of one of his songs, but we haven't got a signature tune.
Yeah, that's true. I won't go. It's difficult to sing without the music.
Indeed, yeah. Well, that's it, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To the Liverpool Talking Newspaper. This is edition number 1885. My name's Sean, and just a couple of birthdays. You've already probably been happy birthdays have been passed to you, but I'm going to do it again because it's Mrs. Dawson in May. Up to present in May, it was Mrs. Dawson, Mrs. Lowe, Linda Jackson, and Stanley Carter and Emily Campbell. Their birthday is tomorrow. So happy birthday to you. And my first reading is taken from the Echo of Tuesday the 6th. And it's about an MP derided for claiming the Tories are party of the working class. I thought that would be an interesting one for you. Former Merseyside MP Esther McVeigh has caused outrage after saying that the Conservative Party is the natural party of the working classes. The controversial ex-Work and Pension Secretary is widely disliked by many voters in Merseyside, having been seen as the face of the Tory benefit policies like the bedroom tax and, more recently, universal credit. Both have been blamed for pushing people into poverty across Merseyside and the country, as well as for causing a rise in people having to use food banks. Tweeting a photo of an article she wrote in the Daily Express, McVeigh shared a photo of the headline which said, "We Tories are the natural party of working classes." She shared the headline, adding in her post, "We believe in freedom, responsibility and choice." Her declaration that the Tories are the natural party for the working classes caused fury online, with a number of people pointing out Conservative policies that have negatively impacted the poorest in society. Keith Mullen from Liverpool banned The Farm said, "Constantly voting for austerity and to punish hard-working people. Throwing the word freedom into the article does not mean you care for hard-working people. Freedom for you means someone else will suffer." I think that will do that one.
Similar sort of vein to Sean's. We've got somebody who's not very happy here with their current situation in life. It's from the Echo and it's headed, "Tenants treated poorly by Housing Association." I'm writing about my in-laws. They've paid rent, first to the council, then to One Vision Housing since 1973. They've never missed a payment and never had any help from benefits because they worked hard and saved for a pension. My mother-in-law died in February, aged 91, and my father-in-law went to live with family. We cleared out his bungalow and gave notice to quit 3 weeks later. And even though he hadn't been living there, they've insisted on 4 weeks' notice. On his pension, he's having to pay still, and although we appreciate that a contract is a contract, you'd think after paying his rent for 46 years there would be some leeway. The day after we passed in the keys, there was a work van outside the bungalow. No doubt renewing everything, decorating, repairing the cracks in the walls, fixing the damp in the bedroom that was making their clothes damp, mouldy and smelly. A new kitchen to replace the one that was falling to bits. Yes, they had a wet room put in for ease of bathing, but that's about all he got for all the years in their properties. The first one being in Bootle, which when they left still had a coke fire for all their heat. It sticks in my throat that this happens. No payment or loyalty holidays, no regular upgrades. Even mortgages get a break. Had he had a mortgage, he would have paid for his housing numerous times over. This couple did not believe in buying council property, so it could be passed to someone else who needed it, but their loyalty was never rewarded, and I'm sure they're not the only ones. I've written to the local MP and to One Vision, but haven't had the courtesy of a reply. I wonder why.